The ocean was restless that night, its surface a black mirror fractured by heaving swells that rose and fell like a living chest. A dense fog had rolled in from the north, swallowing the stars and muffling the horizon. The cargo ship pushed forward with a steady groan, its steel body straining under the weight of both cargo and storm. Somewhere in the depths of that vessel, a signal sparked to life. The ancient rhythm of distress, a Mayday call carved through the static, its words blurred but unmistakable. It was the kind of transmission that froze the breath of anyone listening, because behind the clipped tones and the electronic hum was the raw edge of desperation. The voice carried fragments, coordinates half buried under crackling interference. The mention of water-breaching compartments, the grinding metallic echo of impact. The message looped, broken but urgent, repeating until the silence took over. Radio operators along the coast recorded it, replayed it, strained to decipher the drowned syllables. The fog clung tightly, rendering rescue efforts blind. For hours, ships patrolled the waters near the reported location, their searchlights piercing curtains of mist, catching nothing but foam and emptiness. In the morning, the sea was calm again, as if exhaustion had tamed it. What remained of the cargo vessel was scattered. A floating pallet here, a torn section of lifeboat canvas there, an oil slick stretching thin across the water. The Mayday had been their last trace, a voice swallowed by the Atlantic. Families on shore waited by radios and telephones, clutching photographs that felt suddenly fragile, as if the images themselves might dissolve like salt under rain. The Coast Guard logged the incident, recorded it as a maritime tragedy, another name to the list of ships claimed by the deep. Yet something in the urgency of that Mayday lingered, haunting the operators who had listened. It sounded less like surrender and more like a promise cut short. The ship's log, retrieved later from a waterlogged notebook found drifting near the coast, ended abruptly. Pages blurred with seawater, ink stretched into unreadable stains, but one entry stood clear enough. Weather worsening, visibility near zero, hull under strain. There were no signatures after that, no notes of survival or calm seas returning. The men who had signed those logs had vanished into a void of fog and silence. Weeks turned into months as the investigation deepened, though the ocean yielded nothing more substantial. Divers went down into the depths near the last known coordinates, but currents had swept clean the seabed, leaving no hull, no skeletal remains of a ship, no trace of human presence. It was as if the vessel had been swallowed whole, carried into some hidden pocket of the sea beyond maps and charts. Maritime experts wrote reports, balancing science with speculation, pointing to rogue waves, catastrophic flooding, mechanical failure. Yet none of their explanations could erase the echo of that Mayday, still preserved in recordings that investigators replayed in dim offices. For the families, the absence of bodies was its own torment. Funerals were held without coffins, ceremonies shadowed by unanswered questions. Photographs were placed beside flowers, and prayers were spoken into air that seemed too thin to carry them. Mothers pressed their palms against damp windows, waiting for a knock that never came. Children grew up hearing the story of the lost ship, a tale recited like a fable, but with the sting of bloodline. The ship became part of the ocean's folklore. Sailors spoke of it in ports late at night, lowering their voices as if the sea itself might overhear. Some claimed to have seen its silhouette on foggy horizons, a ghost vessel riding currents with no crew. Others dismissed such talk as the weary imaginations of men too long at sea. But the story endured because it had something no legend could fabricate: a final Mayday, a human voice locked in time. As the years passed, the coordinates of the disappearance became a mark on charts that mariners avoided out of habit. Not cursed, not forbidden, but quietly respected, like a grave left unmarked but known. The ocean above that place often lay deceptively calm, its glassy surface betraying nothing of the screams and steel once swallowed beneath. The Mayday recording found its way into archives, played occasionally by trainees as an example of clarity lost to chaos. Each time it was heard, it brought the same silence to the room, a silence filled with the weight of unfinished words. The cargo ship and its crew slipped from headlines into memory, from memory into legend. The world moved on as it always does, but the ocean never forgets. Somewhere beneath that endless surface, time had buried a secret deeper than any wreck. And though no one could yet know it, that secret was not finished with the world above. For even as the last echoes of the Mayday faded into history, the story of that night was still unfolding, waiting for its return, waiting for a sailor who had not yet let go of the world. The sea has its own kind of silence, a silence that does not mean stillness, but rather an overwhelming absence. In the weeks following the Mayday, that silence pressed against every attempt to uncover what had happened. Rescue ships traced grid patterns over the coordinates, their wakes marking the water with restless geometry. Helicopters droned overhead, their searchlights cutting circles into the night ocean. But there was nothing to reflect back, nothing to prove that life had once moved across that stretch of waves. Each day ended the same: reports of negative sightings, exhausted crews returning to harbors with faces drawn and unspeaking. On shore, entire families clung to shorelines, as if proximity to the ocean might bring answers. Newspapers published photographs of the missing crew, their faces aligned in neat rows like a gallery of absences. Each name was listed with age, hometown, and role aboard the vessel: first mate, cook, engineer, deckhand. But the details only sharpened the emptiness. Letters and telegrams flooded the shipping company's office, demanding explanations, pleading for updates. Official statements spoke of ongoing efforts, of hope balanced against dwindling odds, but behind the words there was only resignation. The ocean had taken them. Among the debris recovered, nothing carried the certainty that loved ones craved. A section of broken railing, bent as though by unimaginable force, was laid out in a warehouse beside coils of sodden rope and splintered wooden crates. The oil slick stretched miles, rainbowed and shimmering in the sun, but no hull ever rose from the depths. Investigators were left with fragments that offered no narrative, only questions. Had the ship broken apart in the storm, or had it slipped intact into an underwater canyon? Had the crew managed to lower lifeboats, or had the violent seas swallowed them too quickly for escape? Weeks bled into months. Slowly the search scaled down, its fleets of ships called back one by one. Coast Guard logs shifted from active rescue to recovery to closed case, though the phrasing felt cruel in its finality. To the families there was no closure, only suspension. Some accepted memorials as the last anchor they would be given. Others refused, clinging to the notion that survival was possible, that the absence of bodies meant something other than death. Rumors sprouted, fed by the natural hunger for hope. A lifeboat sighted far from shore, a message in a bottle carried on currents, even claims of the ship itself appearing on distant horizons before fading into mist. The reality was emptier. The ship was gone, swallowed into the vastness of the Atlantic, leaving behind nothing but that Mayday. And yet that call held more weight than wreckage. Recorded by coastal operators and archived, it continued to resurface in the minds of those who had heard it. The urgency of the voice, the way it broke against static yet pushed through with sheer will, haunted them. Some replayed it late at night, the sound of distress vibrating through speakers, as if the sea itself had been captured in the wires. It became not just evidence, but a relic, a frozen moment where life still spoke from the edge of death. The horizon where the ship had vanished developed a reputation among sailors. Merchant vessels passing through lowered their speed, crews gathering at rails to stare at the stretch of water, as though expecting to glimpse something impossible. It was not marked on official charts as dangerous, but it acquired an aura of unease, as if the sea itself had claimed sovereignty there. Some captains muttered that the ocean did not simply destroy, but sometimes chose to conceal, that certain waters were less like routes and more like thresholds. For the families left ashore, life did not so much resume as reorganize itself around absence. Wives moved houses, children grew up with blurred memories of fathers or brothers. Parents kept empty rooms untouched, as though their sons might walk back through the door at any moment. The story of the vanished ship became a private mythology in these households. The Mayday was recited, the last known position memorized, the theories debated endlessly at dinner tables and in hushed corners of churches. For them, the ocean had not only taken men, it had rewritten time itself, splitting life into before and after. Years began to pile upon years. Headlines shifted to other disasters, other disappearances. The ship's name entered maritime lists of the lost, spoken rarely outside of anniversary articles or niche documentaries. But in certain towns, the memory persisted like salt in the air. At harbors where crew had once set out, plaques were mounted in quiet ceremony, their inscriptions etched with care but never enough to match the weight of what had been left unresolved. The horizon where the vessel vanished remained unchanged. Waves rose and fell, fog drifted across waters, and ships continued to pass, their engines humming the same low notes. Yet the silence of that place held something distinct, as if the ocean itself carried a secret it had no intention of releasing. 30 years would pass before that silence broke, and when it did, the horizon that had seemed empty for so long would once again deliver a shock that no one could have anticipated. Time, relentless in its passage, began to smooth over the edges of the tragedy. Though never fully erasing them, 30 years is long enough for children to become adults, for buildings to rise and fall, for entire generations to be born without memory of an event that once held the world's attention. Yet for those tied to the vanished ship, the silence of those decades was not empty. It was filled with waiting. The archives preserved the Mayday, a scratchy recording filed among countless other maritime transmissions. Occasionally, a cadet in training would stumble upon it, listening with the mixture of fascination and unease that always comes with voices of the lost. To them it was history, something tragic but distant. To the families, however, it was not history but a wound that never properly healed. Every anniversary brought small gatherings by the sea. The faces of those who once clutched photographs grew older, lines etched deep into their skin, their eyes turned toward the same horizon that had swallowed their loved ones. Candles were lit along rocky shorelines, names whispered into salt wind. Yet as the years mounted, attendance thinned. Those who had been closest either aged into frailty or passed on, and younger relatives often attended out of obligation rather than memory. The ocean, indifferent as ever, received their gestures and kept its silence. The shipping company had long since shifted focus to newer fleets, newer profits, the vanished vessel relegated to a page in its history. For them, the loss was part of the ledger, filed away with insurance payouts and closed investigations. Only occasionally, when another disappearance struck headlines, did the company's name resurface in connection with that fateful ship. In those brief moments, old wounds reopened, and journalists once again sought out survivors of the families for quotes, stirring grief that had never been dormant, but merely buried beneath the weight of passing years. And yet, the mystery never fully dissolved into obscurity. Among maritime circles, the story persisted. Sailors shared it in distant bars, sometimes embellishing, sometimes stripping it down to its most chilling core. A desperate Mayday followed by nothingness. Folklore accumulated around it, sightings of ghostly silhouettes at sea, whispers of a ship glimpsed where no ship should be. Most dismissed these stories as the fabrications of men intoxicated by long voyages and too much rum. But a few carried conviction, swearing that they had seen lights where no vessel was reported. The horizon where the ship had vanished remained a place of quiet superstition. Navigators marked it casually on maps, not with official warnings, but with unspoken caution. Crews passing through sometimes left offerings, coins tossed into waves or a moment of silence at the rail. These were not rituals of fear so much as acknowledgments of respect, gestures to a mystery larger than any one man or machine. Meanwhile, the world beyond the ocean moved swiftly. Technology leapt forward. Communication grew instant. Satellites mapped the globe with precision undreamed of 3 decades earlier. And yet, even with all this progress, the vanished ship remained unsolved. It was as though it had slipped not only beneath the sea, but outside of time itself, immune to the reach of modern instruments. In the official records, it remained a closed case. In the hearts of those still waiting, it was an unfinished story. For the children of the crew, those who had grown into adulthood under the shadow of absence, the silence was different from their parents' grief. They had built their lives around unanswered questions, carrying the weight of fathers or uncles or brothers who had never returned. Some sought the sea themselves, believing that in learning its rhythms, they might come closer to understanding what had been lost. Others avoided it altogether, refusing to even stand near a shoreline, as if the ocean might reach for them too. By the 30th year, the story had settled into its strange equilibrium, a tragedy accepted but never understood, a wound that time dulled but never sealed. The Mayday, preserved in archives and in memory, had become almost a mythic artifact, proof that voices could reach across decades even when bodies could not. Then, one morning, the silence fractured. On a remote shoreline battered by tides and forgotten by maps, a figure was seen walking out of the surf. His steps were unsteady, his clothes torn and sun-bleached, his face weathered far beyond his years. Those who found him thought at first he was a drifter, a man broken by storms or solitude. But when his name was spoken aloud, when the records were checked, the truth struck with the force of a wave against stone. He was a sailor from the vanished ship. The coastline where he appeared was a place rarely visited, a crescent of jagged rocks and shifting sands battered endlessly by the tide. Fishermen from a nearby village were the first to see him, a solitary figure staggering across wet sand as if pulled forward by the waves themselves. At a distance he looked like a shadow against the morning haze, his movements unsteady, his posture neither of strength nor of collapse, but something in between, a man who had walked too far without rest. They thought him perhaps a shipwrecked stranger from some small vessel, a man lost at sea for days, maybe weeks. But as they approached, the truth began to unravel. His skin bore the marks of time not measured in days. It was deeply weathered, the texture of leather left in sun and salt. His hair matted and streaked with premature white. His clothes were torn into uneven strips, the fabric thinned and faded by countless exposures to sea and wind. Around his wrist clung the remnants of a sailor's watch, its face cracked, its hands frozen at an hour long past usefulness. In his hand he carried nothing but a small cloth pouch, damp and discolored, yet held tightly as though it contained the weight of an entire life. The villagers guided him inland, their curiosity battling with caution. He did not resist, nor did he speak. His eyes, however, were alive with a strange intensity, darting to every corner of his surroundings as though each detail required careful memorization. He moved not like a man rescued, but like one transported into a world he no longer recognized. At the nearest town, authorities were notified. He was taken to a clinic, where doctors examined him in disbelief. His body showed signs of long malnutrition, offset by an odd resilience. Scars mapped his skin in patterns that spoke of both survival and suffering. He was older than the record suggested he should be. 30 years had indeed passed, but there was something in his bearing that unsettled those who studied him. He seemed both fragile and enduring, like a fragment of wood torn from a shipwreck, yet smoothed by years of waves. When officials asked for his name, he answered quietly, and it was that answer which shattered the silence. His name matched one on the list of the vanished crew, a name etched into plaques by harborside memorials, a name spoken every anniversary by a family who had long since resigned themselves to mourning. He was no drifter, no survivor of some recent storm. He was a sailor who, by every account, should have been gone for 3 decades. The revelation spread quickly. Newspapers rediscovered the story, splashing it across their front pages with headlines that blurred the line between astonishment and disbelief. Lost sailor returns after 30 years, they declared, photographs of the weathered man appearing beside archival images of a young crewman smiling in uniform. The contrast between the two faces was almost unbearable. One vibrant, untested by tragedy, the other worn nearly beyond recognition, but unmistakably the same man. For his family, the news was a shock too heavy for words. Some rushed to see him, trembling with both joy and fear, uncertain if reunion was even possible with a man returned from a timeline none of them had lived. Others hesitated, frightened of what he might carry, of the truths he might reveal. For them, the grief they had carried for 30 years was suddenly destabilized. They had built their lives around absence, and now that absence stood before them in flesh and bone. Authorities, meanwhile, faced questions beyond their capacity to answer. Where had he been? How had he survived? What had happened to the rest of the crew? He offered little at first, speaking slowly as though each word had to be drawn from a place long buried. His memories came not as full accounts, but as fragments, half-formed images, waves rising higher than walls, the shudder of metal tearing, the cold bite of wind in darkness. He spoke of time stretched thin, of nights that seemed unending, of isolation that blurred days into years. His story was not yet whole, but it was enough to reignite a mystery the world had long since closed. Maritime experts reopened files once left to dust, Investigators replayed the Mayday once more, hearing in its urgency a new resonance now that one of its voices had reappeared. Families who had resigned themselves to silence now found themselves pulled back into questions they had tried for decades to bury. The sailor, fragile and yet undeniable, was both miracle and disruption. He had returned, but his return was not an ending. It was the beginning of an unraveling. The promise that the horizon had not yet yielded its final truth. On that shore where he first emerged, villagers continued to speak of the morning they saw him walk out of the surf. Some said he looked less like a man arriving, and more like one returning from some long passage between worlds. And though no one could explain how he had survived, all agreed on one thing. He was not simply a survivor. He was a messenger, carrying with him the weight of everything the sea had chosen not to reveal, at least not yet. When the officials confirmed his identity, the world seemed to pause. The name he had spoken, quiet and halting, matched records preserved for 3 decades. It was written in the ledger of the vanished ship, carved into plaques along the harbor, engraved into the minds of those who had mourned. That name belonged to a young sailor last seen boarding a cargo vessel that never returned. Now it was spoken once again by the man himself, and it fell heavy into every room where it was heard. The newspapers printed it in bold type, pairing it with photographs taken before the tragedy. In those images he was a youth, strong and upright, smiling with the certainty of a life just beginning. Now standing in the present, he bore little resemblance to that photograph except for the outline of his eyes, the same dark gaze that time had weathered but not erased. People stared at the photographs, then at the man, and struggled to reconcile them. The boy of memory was gone, but the sailor remained. For his family, hearing his name again was like reopening a door they had bricked shut. His mother had long since passed, carrying grief into her final years. A brother had aged into fatherhood, raising children who had never known the man except as a face in faded pictures. Nieces and nephews came to meet him, strangers bound to him by blood but not by memory. Some wept openly at the sight of him, overwhelmed by the miracle. Others stood in silence, guarded by suspicion. For 3 decades the name had meant only loss. Now it stood for something they could not yet define. Communities tied to the sea gathered in wonder. Sailors in distant harbors told the story anew, their voices lowered, as if speaking of something sacred. The Mayday call, once a relic of disaster, gained fresh meaning now that one of its speakers had stepped out of silence. Radio operators who had archived the recording listened again and again, pressing their ears to the static, trying to match the broken voice in the transmission to the weary voice now speaking in interviews. Some swore they could hear it. Others insisted the man's tone had changed too deeply to recognize, but all agreed that the connection between past and present could no longer be denied. Officials pressed him for details. Where had he been? How had he lived? What had become of the others? He spoke carefully, his words slow and measured, as though each memory had to be coaxed out of hiding. He did not describe years in clear sequences, but in fragments, storms unending, hunger that gnawed without mercy, nights where the sound of the sea seemed to stretch beyond reason. He mentioned no land at first, no island or shelter, only the endless company of waves and the constant erosion of time. His voice carried not certainty but weight, the heaviness of recollection blurred by distance. In his small cloth pouch, investigators found a handful of items. Inside were 2 rusted coins from a distant port, a scrap of metal bent into a crude shape, and a fragment of paper, nearly illegible, but bearing faint traces of ink. The paper seemed torn from the ship's original logbook, the letters smudged by water, but still hinting at an entry written in haste. The fragment was sent for analysis, but even before results returned, the symbolism was clear. He carried with him pieces of a vanished world. Relics of a ship that had not been seen for 30 years, skeptics emerged quickly. Some argued that he was not who he claimed to be, that perhaps he was an imposter, taking advantage of a tragedy preserved in memory. Others pointed to the physical evidence, the matching scars noted in the sailor's medical records, the faded tattoo on his forearm, identical to one described by his crewmates, the DNA analysis that confirmed his lineage. Piece by piece, doubt crumbled, and what remained was undeniable. This man was who he claimed to be, a sailor lost and now returned. His reappearance shook more than families. It unsettled the certainty with which history had closed its chapters. For decades, the ship had been filed under vanished, its story sealed by silence. Now one survivor tore open that seal, forcing historians, officials, and ordinary people alike to confront the possibility that the sea had held more than just emptiness all this time. His name, spoken aloud, carried not only identity, but defiance against the ocean's claim. And yet, even as his name returned him to the living, questions deepened. Why him alone? Where had he been while the world carried on without him? What became of the others whose names remained carved in stone? His presence was both a gift and a haunting, for in answering one question, he awakened 1,000 more. At night he lay in a hospital bed, eyes open in the dark, listening to the hum of modern machines. Around him the world had transformed in his absence, screens glowing with light, voices carried instantly across distance, devices more foreign than familiar. He was both at home and displaced, belonging to a world that had not waited for him. But his name was his anchor, and with it he had pulled himself back into existence. The sea had returned him, but not without scars, and as the world adjusted to his reappearance, whispers began to grow. If one man could emerge from silence after 30 years, then perhaps the story of the vanished ship was not finished. The days following his reemergence were marked not by clarity, but by a slow unraveling of fragments, pieces of a story that refused to align neatly. The sailor's words came in bursts, never flowing in a straight line, never forming a narrative with beginning and end. Doctors observed him carefully, noting that his memory did not function as theirs did. Instead of recalling dates or sequences, he carried impressions, images, sensations that clung like sea mist long after the tide receded. He spoke of storms first, storms that seemed unending, where the sky remained black for days and the waves rose higher than the ship itself. He remembered metal screaming as if alive, rivets snapping, beams twisting, the cargo shifting violently in its hold. Yet when pressed for exact details, he could not recall the precise moment of the sinking. Time for him fractured into chaos, a blur where night and day lost their meaning. Sometimes he described silence, a silence heavier than the roar of the sea, the kind that pressed against his chest until even breathing felt like defiance. He remembered waiting, always waiting, though he could not explain what he had waited for, rescue, death, or something in between. He mentioned shadows of others, voices he thought he heard, men who were there and then gone, their presence fading like the outline of ships on distant horizons. Were they real companions, or only echoes his mind created to keep him from breaking? No one could tell, not even he. Investigators pieced together his words as if assembling a shattered map. There were hints of land, an outline glimpsed through, fog, a jagged shoreline where the waves hurled him against rock. But he could not name it, could not place it on any chart. His descriptions of vegetation, of strange fruits and coarse grass, fit no single geography with certainty. At times, he seemed to contradict himself, describing barren coasts in one breath and dense green in the next. It was as if he had walked through multiple worlds, none of them anchored firmly in memory. The years themselves resisted clarity. When asked how long he had lived in solitude, his answer shifted. Sometimes he said months, other times years, and once he murmured that time itself had stopped. Doctors suggested trauma, the mind's defense against unbearable isolation, yet others wondered if something stranger was at play, if his experience of time had truly stretched and warped in ways science struggled to explain. He aged, of course, 30. Years had marked his body, though not in the way expected. His face bore deep lines, his skin the texture of a man who had endured far more than the ordinary weight of decades. And yet his strength remained, his eyes sharp, his body lean but not broken. Medical examiners marveled at how he had survived. At all, how malnutrition and exposure had not claimed him long before. It was as if he had lived in cycles of deprivation and survival that defied probability. The fragment of the ship's log he carried became an object of obsession. Under magnification, faint words emerged, phrases of worsening seas, compartments taking water, and then nothing more. The last line, smeared but legible enough, read simply, "Hold fast." Whether it was a note of command, a plea, or a final attempt at courage, no one could say. To him, it was the only written proof that his memory of the night was not an invention. As his story spread, it drew both believers and skeptics. Some saw in him proof of the endurance of the human spirit, a man who had outlasted the sea's attempt to erase him. Others accused him of deception, suggesting he had lived elsewhere, under assumed identity, only to re-emerge with a fabricated tale. Yet even those skeptics fell quiet in his presence, for there was something undeniable in his silence, in the way his gaze lingered on the horizon as if he still saw waves that were not there. His fractured recollections did not provide answers so much as widen the mystery. If he had lived on land, why had no one found him? If others had survived, why had no one else returned? If he had been alone, how had he endured without succumbing to madness or despair? Each question fractured into more, until the timeline of his survival looked less like a line and more like a web, tangled and incomplete. At night, in the quiet of the hospital where he was kept under observation, he sometimes sat upright in bed and stared at the window. He did not look at the stars or the city lights beyond. He looked at the darkness between, as though listening for the hum of waves. Nurses noted these moments in their logs, but could not bring themselves to disturb him. There was a gravity in his posture, as though he was not in the present at all, but pulled backward into that endless horizon where time itself had come undone. And so the fractured timeline remained, unresolved, incomplete, a puzzle without borders. Yet within its broken edges lay the promise of something greater, something that might explain not only his survival, but the fate of the ship itself. For if he had returned, then perhaps the silence of the ocean was not as absolute as it seemed. The world had expected his return to bring answers, but instead it brought uncertainty that spread like ripples across the lives of those who had once mourned him. Time had not stood still for the families of the vanished crew. It had moved forward, with the stubborn persistence of the tide, reshaping their existence around absence. Now, with one man stepping back into their world, the careful balance of grief and survival was disturbed. For his relatives, the reunion was not simple joy. 30 years had carved deep divides, not only in age but in identity. The sailor they had known was preserved in memory as a young man, frozen at the moment of departure, while the man who now stood before them was marked by decades of hardship. His brother, now grey-haired and slowed by the weight of years, embraced him with tears that blurred recognition. Nieces and nephews looked on with curiosity more than connection, their idea of him formed only from stories and faded photographs. To them he was a living myth, and myths were difficult to love in the ordinary way of family. His return stirred unspoken resentments as well. Some had built their lives upon the certainty of his death, had mourned him, accepted his absence, and moved forward. To reopen those wounds felt unfair, even cruel. One relative, in a quiet moment, confessed that it was easier when he was gone, easier when grief was a straight path instead of this jagged circle of confusion. His presence was both gift and burden, a reminder that closure had been an illusion all along. Beyond his family, the weight of his return extended to the community of the lost. Other families, who had never seen their sons or fathers or brothers return, were torn between hope and despair. If one man could survive, why not another? Why not theirs? The questions surfaced like old wounds, reopening scars. Some found renewed faith, believing their loved ones still lived somewhere, waiting. Others felt bitterness, unable to accept why this one man had been chosen to return, while the rest remained names on memorial stones. The sailor himself seemed to bear this weight as though it were heavier than any storm. In interviews, he spoke with hesitation, aware that his words carried consequences not just for himself, but for all those still lost. Each time he was asked about his crewmates, his silence pressed deeper into the room. Sometimes he shook his head, sometimes his gaze drifted beyond the window, but he never gave clear answers. Whether he could not remember or would not speak, no one could tell. Doctors described him as a man caught between eras. His health showed resilience, but also the unmistakable imprint of survival under extreme duress. His muscles were lean, his reflexes sharp, yet his body carried marks of prolonged hunger and untreated wounds. His mind, too, bore the traces of long solitude. He was slow to adjust to noise, to crowds, to the rush of modern life. The world he had left behind had vanished in his absence. The one he returned to felt overwhelming, unrecognizable. The weight of time revealed itself most clearly when he was confronted with the simplest changes. Streetlights glowing with LEDs, devices that spoke with human voices, screens that placed distant faces within arm's reach, all of it unsettled him. He handled objects cautiously, as if they might shatter or disappear. In quiet moments, he turned instead to things that had not changed. The sound of gulls, the smell of salt carried inland, the steady rhythm of waves striking rocks. These were constants, the same as the world he had left behind, the only anchors he trusted. Reporters followed him relentlessly, seeking a story, a headline, an explanation. But each time they pressed him, his responses grew shorter, his discomfort more visible. Eventually, authorities intervened, shielding him from public intrusion. Still, whispers circulated. Was he hiding something? Was there knowledge he carried that the world was not yet ready to hear? The uncertainty only added to the legend already growing around him. In the village where he had first emerged from the surf, the people spoke of him differently. They had seen him in that first moment, a solitary figure crossing the threshold between sea and land. To them, he was not only a man but a symbol of endurance, a living contradiction to the certainty of loss. Some even treated the beach where he appeared as a place of quiet reverence, leaving tokens of respect along the rocks, shells, flowers, small coins. Yet the sailor himself seemed to shrink beneath the weight of all this meaning. He was a man who had endured beyond what most could imagine, and yet survival had not freed him from the ocean's claim. The weight of time pressed down on him, not only as years lost, but as questions unanswered, responsibilities he had not chosen. He carried the silence of the others with him, and in that silence lay the heaviest burden of all at night. Those who cared for him noted how he often sat awake, his hands resting on the pouch he had carried from the sea. He never opened it in front of them, but he touched it as one touches a talisman, something both fragile and essential. Whatever it contained, it seemed to anchor him, to hold back the tide of memories threatening to overwhelm. Time had taken much from him, youth, companions, clarity, but in return, it had given him endurance, a life stretched against all odds. The question that lingered was whether that endurance was meant for survival alone, or for carrying the truth of what had happened to the ship and those still missing from the horizon of history. The return of the sailor unsettled not only families and communities, but also the institutions tasked with guarding truth. Investigators who had once closed the file on the vanished cargo ship now reopened it, their offices filled with the sound of shuffled papers, the glow of old microfilms, and the playback of a Mayday call that had haunted archives for 3 decades. What had long been a tragedy frozen in history was now active again, demanding explanation. The sailor was placed under quiet observation, not in secrecy, but in discretion. Teams of maritime experts, psychologists, and forensic specialists sought to piece together what fragments of his memory could be corroborated with evidence. They began with the obvious, his physical body. Scars mapped across his skin told a story of long endurance. Jagged lines that spoke of falls against rock, burns healed without treatment, cuts that had closed unevenly. His teeth revealed prolonged malnutrition, though his bones showed remarkable resilience, as though survival had forced his body into a rhythm beyond ordinary human endurance. DNA tests confirmed his identity, erasing doubts that he might be an imposter. The results matched archived samples taken from his family decades earlier. Fingerprints compared with employment records aligned as well. Every test placed him firmly in the past, tethered to the name he had spoken. Science confirmed what intuition had already declared. He was the sailor who should not have been alive, but confirmation only deepened the puzzle. His belongings, those few relics pulled from the pouch he guarded, became the focus of intense scrutiny. The rusted coins were traced to a port where the ship had last docked before its disappearance, common currency of the time, but weathered into near unrecognizability. The bent scrap of metal resisted classification, appearing at first as nothing more than refuse, but under careful analysis, investigators noted markings consistent with interior fittings of the vanished ship's engine room. The fragment of paper, torn from the logbook, underwent chemical testing that confirmed its age, the ink smudged by seawater but authentic to the period. The single legible phrase, "hold fast," became both clue and enigma, as though the ship itself had spoken through its final entry. Interviews with the sailor yielded less certainty. He answered questions with fragments describing storms, hunger, silence, and shapes of land half-remembered. When asked for dates, he faltered. When pressed to recall events in sequence, he shook his head. Time for him was not linear. It stretched, bent, dissolved. He remembered sensations, the sound of waves striking stone, the taste of rain collected in cupped hands, the feel of coarse rope worn thin, but not the framework investigators craved. His testimony was less evidence than atmosphere, rich with detail but poor in chronology. Still, patterns began to emerge. In scattered recollections, he described fires flickering against night skies, the smell of smoke carried across water, and voices fading into silence. He spoke of a shoreline jagged and hostile, where survival meant carving sustenance from unforgiving terrain. He hinted at the presence of others. Footsteps not his own, shadows moving in darkness, but whether these were survivors or hallucinations born of solitude, he could not say. Each answer he gave seemed to birth two new questions. Authorities debated privately. Was it possible he had washed ashore on some forgotten island, lived in isolation for years, and only now found his way back? Satellite mapping of the modern era had charted nearly every corner of the globe, yet the ocean still held places hidden by scale and indifference. Could an entire group of men have survived unseen, only to vanish again except for this one? If so, where were the others? Why him alone? Psychologists weighed in, suggesting that trauma had fractured his memory, blurring boundaries between reality and perception. They warned against pressing him too hard, noting that his fragmented recollections might collapse entirely under strain. Yet there were those who believed his story contained a truth larger than science could yet explain. For them, the sailor was not a puzzle to be solved, but a witness to forces the ocean still kept hidden. Public attention surged. Newspapers speculated wildly, documentaries began production, and communities debated late into the night. Some believed he had been stranded on a remote island. Others whispered of ships carried into strange currents, of time bending on horizons where compasses failed. Theories multiplied, but none could explain why, after 30 years, the sea had chosen to return him. Within the investigation, the pouch he carried remained central. He guarded it fiercely, reluctant to let it leave his sight even for analysis. Though scientists studied its contents, he always asked for it back, fingers closing around it as though it were the last tether to his survival. In his eyes, the pouch was more than evidence. It was memory distilled into objects that kept him from dissolving into silence, and so the puzzle remained unsolved. Every piece of evidence confirmed his identity, but none revealed the larger truth. The Mayday still echoed with its clipped urgency. The log fragment still whispered its plea to hold fast, and the man himself still sat with his silence, carrying answers he either could not or would not release. Investigators pressed forward, but the ocean had left them with a story half told, as though daring them to look deeper. For beneath every fragment of evidence lay the same unyielding question. What had happened to the ship? And why had only one man returned to bear the silence of all the rest? The more they questioned him, the more his memories surfaced not as a sequence but as sensations, the kind that cling to the body long after the mind has lost its bearings. What he recalled most vividly was not the ship breaking apart nor the sound of his crewmates' voices, but salt, the taste of it, the sting of it, the way it clung to his skin until it seemed part of him. Salt was survival, and salt was suffering, and in its memory lay pieces of truth. He described days when water was both enemy and salvation. Rain gathered in small pools on rock was his only drink. The sea, wide and merciless, offered food in fragments. Fish caught by hand, shellfish pried loose, seaweed chewed until his jaw ached. He remembered the texture of it all, the grit of sand between his teeth, the burn of raw flesh eaten in desperation, the numbness that followed starvation's edge. In these details, investigators found more than imagination. They found the echo of survival practices known to castaways throughout history. Objects corroborated his words. Among the items in his pouch was a small length of rope, twisted and frayed, hardened by salt. He explained haltingly that it had once tied together makeshift shelters built from driftwood and debris. Another scrap of cloth bore faint traces of soot, suggesting fires kindled on damp ground. Each fragment was small, almost meaningless on its own, yet together they formed the outline of endurance, proof that he had not only lived through solitude, but carved life from elements most would consider unlivable. Yet his memories were not only of survival. He spoke of sounds that returned to him in the stillness of night, footsteps not his own, voices carried on the wind, laughter that vanished before he could turn to follow. Were they companions, fellow survivors who had shared the early days before being taken by the sea? Or were they inventions of his mind, desperate attempts to fill the void of silence? He could not say. His eyes grew distant whenever he spoke of them, as though part of him still followed those echoes into darkness. There was one object he never explained. From the pouch came a shard of glass, edges dulled by years but still translucent. On its surface faint markings were etched, not letters, not symbols exactly, but scratches deliberate enough to suggest intention. When asked what they meant, he pressed his lips together and shook his head. Whether he did not know or chose not to say, no one could determine. That fragment became the most mysterious of all, as though it belonged not only to survival, but to some unspoken message. The scent of salt remained in his descriptions, inescapable. He recalled the way storms drove spray so thick it became air itself, the way nights grew heavy with dampness, how his skin cracked beneath layers of salt that never washed away. He said that time became measured not by sun or moon, but by the rhythm of waves against shore. Days merged, marked only by hunger's return or the brief relief of rain. The weight of solitude pressed on him, and he admitted with a quiet voice that there were moments when he questioned whether he had already died, whether the world of memory had ended, and he was living in some echo without time. Investigators catalogued each word, each fragment of evidence, but the picture they built refused completion. What emerged was not a single story, but overlapping layers. A man who survived storms and hunger, a man who remembered companions that may have never been, a man who carried objects that testified to both the ship and some unknown place. The memory of salt was his clearest truth, but it was also the least specific, a reminder that survival is often defined not by clarity, but by endurance. For the families listening to his accounts, each fragment stirred conflicting emotions. Some heard in his memories the confirmation that their own loved ones had shared the same struggles, even if they had not returned. Others felt bitterness, the reminder that he alone had lived to tell the story, while their names remained carved in stone. The more he revealed, the more the weight of absence pressed on those still waiting for closure. The sailor himself seemed caught between worlds. When he spoke, it was as if he relived sensations rather than narrated them, as if he were still walking those jagged shores, still tasting salt on his lips. At times he fell silent in mid-sentence, his eyes fixed as though listening to waves only he could hear. His survival had brought him back to land, but the ocean had not released him fully. The memory of salt, heavy and persistent, clung not only to his words, but to his very presence. It was the trace of the sea carried into the present, proof of years that had refused to fade. Yet within it remained the larger question, unspoken but inevitable. If he had endured, where had the others gone? Did the salt preserve only him, or had it once carried many before the sea claimed them? In his silence, the weight of that question grew heavier. Pressing toward an answer the world was not yet ready to hear. The fragments of his memory, scattered and resistant to order, began to form a faint geography when studied together. Investigators noticed how often he returned to the image of jagged shorelines, to the sound of waves striking cliffs, to the smell of soil not carried by ships, but rooted in land. Though he could never name a place, though he denied knowing coordinates, there was no mistaking it. Somewhere within the fractured timeline, land had held him. Theories multiplied. Satellite imagery was combed for anomalies, small islands too remote to be charted, coastlines altered by storms or volcanic shifts. Old records revealed that, in the decades of his absence, cartographers had quietly corrected maps, removing places once marked but never confirmed, adding others that storms had exposed. The ocean was vast enough to hide such places, and the sailor's words suggested he had known one of them intimately. When asked about it directly, he did not answer with certainty, but with fragments of sensation. He described rocks that glistened black when wet, cutting the feet if one climbed them barefoot. He remembered a patch of sand that shifted with each tide, a place where he once drew lines to count days until the sea erased them again. He recalled vegetation, low shrubs, coarse grasses, and trees with twisted trunks that bore fruit small and bitter, but edible enough to sustain. He mentioned birds, flocks of them, their cries sharp against endless skies. Each description was simple, and yet together they painted the outline of a place more real than imagined. In his pouch, evidence seemed to confirm it. The rope hardened by salt bore knots not of ships, but of makeshift shelters, tied in ways that suggested adaptation to terrain. The shard of glass, under careful study, showed signs of having been etched with deliberate marks, perhaps by hand, perhaps as a record of days or as a signal to others. Soil traces found within the cloth fibers did not match the shores where he was discovered, but they hinted at volcanic origin, pointing to an island once alive with fire and now silent under the sea's watch. Scholars debated whether this island was a known place or one erased by time. Some pointed to accounts of sailors across centuries who had spoken of lands glimpsed and then lost, of islands that appeared only to vanish beneath fog. Others suggested a more grounded truth, that storms had concealed a small landmass long enough for it to slip through modern maps, a place forgotten not because it was mystical, but because it was remote and hostile. The sailor himself never spoke the word island, but when his memories were recited back to him, he closed his eyes and nodded, as if confirming without admitting. For him it was not a place to name, but a place to endure. He described nights spent with fire sputtering against damp wind, mornings gathering water trapped in leaves, days searching the horizon for sails that never came. He spoke of caves in cliffs, where shadows lingered even at noon, and of the echo of waves crashing into stone. In one rare moment of clarity, he admitted that he was not always alone. There were others, at least at first. He remembered their voices, remembered sharing fish caught in tidal pools, remembered laughter that sounded foreign after storms, but he could not or would not say what became of them. The silence after those recollections was heavier than any storm he described. Some suspected they had died, taken one by hunger, illness, or sea. Others whispered that perhaps they had left him, vanished in ways he could not explain. His refusal to detail their fate kept the mystery alive. For the families of the lost, the suggestion of an island was both torment and hope. If their loved ones had once stood on solid ground, then perhaps they had lived beyond the Mayday, lived longer than the sea had admitted. But that hope carried sharp edges. Why had none of them returned? Why him alone? The forgotten island, whether real or imagined, became a place of haunting in their minds, a land where survival might have been possible, but where silence ultimately prevailed. Expeditions were proposed. Teams of researchers argued for searching coordinates, suggested by his descriptions, mapping areas of the Atlantic where volcanic outcroppings could match. But the ocean resisted intrusion. Weather thwarted attempts, storms rose without warning, and each expedition returned with charts unaltered, with only deeper respect for the sea's refusal to yield. The forgotten island remained out of reach, more shadow than certainty, existing in the space between memory and map, yet its presence lingered. The sailor carried it with him in every pause, every detail of survival etched into his body. He might never name it, but the island was inscribed in him, proof that he had not simply floated adrift but lived on ground no one else remembered. The forgotten island was both prison and refuge, both grave and cradle, the stage where 30 years had bent into silence. And as he walked once more along the coast where he had reappeared, villagers whispered that perhaps the island had never been meant to be found. Perhaps it was not forgotten at all, but hidden, kept by the sea as a place known only to those who had endured it, and to those who had never left. The world waited for answers that never fully arrived. Investigators had mapped fragments of evidence, scientists had tested his belongings, families had listened with desperate ears, and yet the truth of what had happened to the vanished ship remained incomplete. The sailor's return was undeniable fact, but it was also an unsolved riddle, a reminder that survival does not always deliver clarity. What it delivers instead is presence, a body that proves endurance, a voice that proves the past is not entirely gone. The man himself grew quieter as the months passed. The first urgency of questions gave way to a quieter rhythm, and he began to settle into a life both ordinary and extraordinary. He lived near the sea, unable to part from the horizon, as though still tethered by a cord invisible to all but him. He walked along the shoreline at dawn, listening to gulls, watching waves rise and collapse with the same patience he had learned across decades of solitude. To outsiders he appeared haunted, but those who knew him best recognized something gentler. A man simply attuned to silence. The families of the lost continued to reach out. Some embraced him, believing his survival offered proof that their own loved ones had fought just as hard, even if they had not returned. Others could not bear his presence, resenting him for living when the others had not. At memorial gatherings, his face became both symbol and wound, proof that hope was not foolish, but also a reminder that hope was uneven, given to one and withheld from many. Maritime institutions closed the reopened case without satisfaction. They acknowledged his survival, documented the fragments he carried, and filed updated reports. But the ship itself remained missing, its crew, except for one, still absent. In official records, the story ended in the same place it always had, a Mayday call, a disappearance, silence. What had changed was not the conclusion, but the echo that followed. His reappearance ensured that the legend would never settle fully into history. It would remain alive, suspended between fact and myth. The sailor, for his part, offered no resolution. When asked about the forgotten island, about the voices he claimed to have heard, about the fate of the others, he gave the same responses. Sometimes silence, sometimes fragments, never a complete account. Perhaps he truly did not remember. Perhaps the memories were too fractured to rebuild. Or perhaps he knew more than he would admit, guarding truths that belonged not to him but to the sea. And so he lived, neither hero nor mystery solved, but something in between, a living echo of the ship that had vanished. His presence reminded the world that the ocean does not give back in full. It returns only what it chooses, in its own time. For 30 years it had held him and then, without explanation, released him again. That act alone defied certainty, and certainty was what the world had sought most. Children grew up hearing his story as one hears a legend. They learned of the Mayday in the fog, of the horizon that swallowed a ship whole, of a man who walked back from silence 3 decades later. Some believed it as proof of endurance, others as evidence that the sea holds secrets humans may never master. And, as with all legends, the truth was less important than the telling. The way the story carried on, refusing to fade. At night, when the air grew still, he would sometimes sit on the shore with the pouch beside him. The items within had been catalogued, tested, photographed, but he still kept them close, not as evidence but as memory. To him they were not artifacts but anchors, reminders of years that could not be explained but had been lived. He did not need the world to believe. He only needed to remember. The ocean rolled on, indifferent as ever, its surface reflecting stars that cared nothing for men or ships or mysteries. Yet beneath its silence, somewhere in its endless depths, the story of the vanished vessel remained. Whether buried in wreckage or scattered across forgotten coasts, it was still there, carried in currents and tides. And above, walking the shore, one man remained as proof that silence does not always last forever. He was not an answer but an echo that lived and in living ensured that the story of the ship would never be fully lost.